The air is thin at 20,000 feet. January Eastern Front. The engines. Vibration bleeds through the fuselage like a living pulse. Below, the cloud deck is torn open by winter light. Above, the sky is suddenly alive. Dark specks fall out of the sun. Messerschmitt Bf 109's fast, disciplined, already angling for the kill. They come, as they always do, from above, from behind, from the blind arcs. Doctrine says they are safe. Inside the aircraft, the gunner does not look away. His gloves are stiff with cold. His breath fogs the metal housing of the gun. He knows the odds. He has seen what happens when fighters line up cleanly, make their passes, peel away untouched. So he does something no manual teaches, something instructors warn against, something pilots will later call suicidal. He does not wait. He does not conserve ammunition. He brings the enemy closer. Tracer fire erupts not in retreat, but in defiance, climbing straight into the attacking formation. The sky fractures into smoke, debris, and sudden fireballs. For a few violent minutes, the balance of air combat shifts in ways no one fully understands yet, and when the firing stops, nothing about aerial warfare will ever feel quite the same. By the winter of 1940 to 1943, the air war over Europe and the Eastern Front had entered a phase of brutal clarity. The early illusions were gone. Speed alone did not guarantee survival. Courage did not stop cannon fire, and altitude, once considered safety, had become a hunting ground. Fighter doctrine had matured faster than bomber defense. German pilots flying the Messerschmitt Bf 109, by then in its F and early G variants, were veterans of Spain, France, and the opening years of Operation Barbarossa. They had learned discipline, patience, the mathematics of air combat. They attacked in pairs and flights, diving from the sun, firing in short, precise bursts, then climbing away before return fire could find them. For bomber and ground attack crews, the situation was grim. Whether flying Soviet Il-2 Sturmovix on the Eastern Front or Allied medium and heavy bombers farther west, survival depended on formation, overlapping fields of fire, and the hope that enemy fighters would make mistakes. The reality was harsher. Loss rates were catastrophic. Crews were trained knowing that statistically, many would not survive their first 10 missions. Gunners were especially vulnerable. They were often the youngest men aboard. They sat isolated in plexiglass blisters or open positions, exposed to cold, vibration, and incoming fire. Their role was defensive by definition. They were taught to wait until the enemy committed to an attack run, to conserve ammunition, to fire only when the target filled the sights. This doctrine assumed rational behavior on both sides. The Bf 109 exploited it mercilessly. German pilots understood the firing arcs of enemy aircraft almost as well as the crews themselves. They approached from angles that minimized exposure. They knew when a gunner could not depress or elevate far enough. They trusted speed and geometry more than bravery. A clean pass could cripple an aircraft in seconds, kill the pilot, ignite fuel tanks, shatter control surfaces, and the fighter would be gone before the gunner could adjust. By late 1942, Luftwaffe records showed increasing success against unescorted or poorly defended formations. Soviet and Allied after-action reports told the same story from the other side. Aircraft returning riddled with holes, crews dead at their stations, gunners killed before firing more than a handful of rounds. It was within this environment that desperation began to influence behavior. Some crews flew closer together than regulations allowed. Others ignored ammunition discipline. A few pilots deliberately altered formations to confuse attackers, even at the risk of collision. These were not officially sanctioned tactics. They were survival instincts, asserting themselves against rigid doctrine. On the Eastern Front, the situation was even more unforgiving. Distances were vast. Weather was brutal. Aircraft operated at low altitudes over front lines, saturated with flak. The Soviet Il-2, heavily armored but slow and poorly defended early in the war, became a priority target for German fighters. Losses were so severe that early models flew without rear gunners at All until experience forced a change. When rear gunners were introduced, they were given minimal training and limited ammunition. Their presence was meant to discourage, not dominate. The assumption remained that fighters would always dictate the terms of engagement. But air combat is not fought only with machines and equations. It is fought by men under pressure, reacting in fractions of a second. And occasionally, one of those men reaches a conclusion others cannot or will not. That realization was forming in the cockpit and gun position of one aircraft on a cold winter mission. a moment when doctrine felt insufficient, when waiting felt like surrender. The stage was set. The sky was already crowded with predators. And the next section of this story begins, where strategic theory meets the raw mechanics of steel, speed, and human limits. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was not feared because it was indestructible. It was feared because it was efficient, light, fast, and unforgiving. It punished hesitation. By 1943, most frontline units were flying the Bf 109G, armed with a 20mm or 30mm cannon, firing through the propeller hub, supported by heavy machine guns in the nose. A short burst was often enough. Against bombers or attack aircraft, precision mattered more than volume. German pilots were trained to think in angles and seconds, closing speed, deflection, escape vector. They were not duelists, they were hunters. A successful pass meant minimal exposure, maximum damage, and immediate separation. Anything that disrupted this rhythm introduced risk. Opposing them were cruise-flying aircraft that were never meant to win air superiority. Soviet Il-2 for example, operated a machine designed to survive ground fire, not fighter attack. Armor protected the engine and cockpit, but left other areas exposed. Early variants had blind rear arcs, and even later models with a rear gunner offered limited coverage. The gun itself, Forfen at 12.7mm Berezin UBT, was powerful but slow-firing compared to fighter weapons, and its ammunition supply was finite. The gunner's world was a narrow tunnel of vision. Cold air burned the face. Frost formed on goggles. Communication with the pilot was limited, sometimes reduced to prearranged signals or brief shouts over intercom distorted by engine noise. Reaction time mattered more than theory. Training manuals emphasized restraint. A gunner who fired too early revealed his position and wasted ammunition. A gunner who tracked a single attacker too long exposed the aircraft to another. The safest course, according to doctrine, was patience. But patience relied on the attacker behaving predictably. By the middle years of the war, Luftwaffe pilots had grown accustomed to gunners who waited. They initiated attacks knowing they could close to effective range before facing serious fire. They trusted their approach angles. Many had survived dozens of engagements by doing the same thing over and over. This confidence shaped their behavior. What they did not expect was an aircraft that did not flinch. On this particular mission, the attacking fighters committed aggressively. Multiple Bf 109s dove in rapid succession, confident in the established pattern. They anticipated return fire only at the final seconds of their approach, when speed would already be carrying them clear. Instead, they encountered something different. The gunner did not wait for the perfect sight picture. He did not attempt to conserve ammunition for a long engagement he knew would never come. He opened fire early, delivered the fighters to fly through expanding cones of tracer and lead. The tactic was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. Denied the attacker a clean approach by turning every second of closure into risk. This was not taught. It was not approved. It violated every principle of defensive gunnery taught up to that point. Firing early reduced accuracy. It burned ammunition. It invited return fire at longer range. It also did something else. It forced German pilots to make choices they were not used to making. Break off too early and waste the attack. Continue through the fire and trust speed and luck. Hesitate and lose both. In the compressed chaos of aerial combat, even a moment's uncertainty could be fatal. A slight adjustment of aim, a fraction of a second longer in the cone of fire, a wingtip clipped, a radiator punctured. This mission would compress all of those variables into a handful of violent minutes. And to understand why the outcome would resonate far beyond the aircraft involved, we must examine the event from multiple perspectives: human, tactical, technological, and moral, each revealing a different truth about what happened in the sky that day. From the gunner's position, there was no panorama of battle. There was no elegant choreography of aircraft against the sky. There was only vibration, cold, and the sudden appearance of shapes growing rapidly larger. Fear was not abstract. It was physical. The tightening of muscles, the involuntary holding of breath, the knowledge earned from earlier missions that hesitation meant death, not just for oneself, but for everyone aboard. Gunners were trained to suppress instinct, to wait, to aim carefully, to trust that discipline would compensate for vulnerability. But repeated exposure to loss reshaped that instinct. Men learned from what they saw, not what manuals promised. They learned that enemy fighters rarely missed at close range. By the time the sights were perfectly aligned, it was often already too late. At this moment, The gunner's decision was not heroic in the traditional sense, it was practical. If waiting invited destruction, then initiative became the only remaining variable he could control. He accepted the risk of being seen sooner. He accepted the possibility of running out of ammunition. He accepted that return fire would begin earlier. What he rejected was passivity. As he pressed the trigger, the gun bucked violently, each round a small explosion of recoil and noise. Tracer streaks tore upward, not as a precise stream but as a widening corridor of danger. The gunner was not trying to hit a single aircraft. He was trying to make space lethal. This required endurance as much as courage. The weapon overheated quickly. Arms burned from fighting recoil. Visibility degraded as smoke and debris filled the air. There was no pause to assess success, only the next approaching silhouette. From the perspective of the attacking Bf 109 pilots, the situation was immediately wrong. The approach they had used countless times was suddenly compromised. Tracer fire appeared earlier than expected, extending the danger zone. Instead of a brief moment of exposure at the end of the attack run, they now faced sustained fire throughout the dive. Tactically, this destroyed the efficiency of their attack geometry. A fighter diving at high speed relies on predictability of both target and engagement window. Early defensive fire forced adjustments. Small corrections to avoid tracers disrupted aim. Pilots had to choose between pressing on through visible fire or breaking off prematurely. Breaking off reduced risk but wasted altitude and energy. Pressing on increased exposure time at exactly the moment when speed made control most difficult. In a multi-aircraft attack, these decisions compounded. One fighter's evasive maneuver disrupted spacing. Another pilot, committed to his dive, found his line of fire obstructed. Timing unraveled. The gunner's tactic did not require extraordinary marksmanship. It relied on volume, timing, and psychology. Tracers served not just as bullets, but as signals warnings of where death might be. Even disciplined pilots could not ignore them. As fighters passed through the expanding cone of fire, some were struck not by direct hits to the cockpit, but by glancing impact swings, control surfaces, radiators, damage that did not destroy instantly, but robbed aircraft of performance. A damaged fighter could not climb as sharply, could not accelerate as cleanly, could not rejoin the fight with the same confidence. Within minutes, the engagement shifted from a controlled hunt to a chaotic melee. German pilots reported difficulty completing clean attack runs. Soviet and Allied reports from similar engagements later noted something new: fighters breaking off attacks earlier, or approaching with more caution. The gunner's tactic did not overturn air superiority. It did not make bombers invulnerable, but it introduced friction into a system that depended on smooth execution. The sky became less predictable, and in air combat, unpredictability is often more dangerous than firepower. As tracer fire faded and smoke trails marked damaged aircraft descending away, the implications of what had just occurred began to ripple outward beyond the immediate survival of one crew, toward questions of technology, enemy perception, and the unspoken moral boundaries of warfare itself. The gun at the center of this moment was not advanced by fighter standards. It lacked the rate of fire, muzzle velocity, and precision of the Bf 109's armament. Its strength lay elsewhere in sustained output and intimidation. Defensive guns were designed to create zones, not duels. Their ammunition included tracer rounds specifically so attackers could see where fire was directed. This visibility, often considered a liability because it revealed the gunner's position, became an asset when used aggressively. At longer ranges, accuracy declined sharply, but physics still applied. A fast-moving aircraft passing through a dense volume of fire increased the probability of contact. Even non-critical hits could rupture coolant lines, damage control cables, or unbalance control surfaces. Aircraft of the era were robust but not forgiving. The Bf 109's liquid-cooled engine was particularly vulnerable to radiator damage. A single puncture could force a pilot to disengage within minutes or face engine seizure. The gunner's early, continuous firing exploited these vulnerabilities indirectly. He was not attempting surgical destruction. He was increasing the chance that something, somewhere, would fail. German pilots prided themselves on discipline. Luftwaffe training emphasized calm aggression and controlled risk. But even veteran pilots operated within expectations. When those expectations were violated, reaction times suffered. Post-war accounts and wartime reports from German units occasionally mention encounters with unexpectedly aggressive defensive fire. While not always linked to specific losses, These descriptions reveal a pattern. Surprise undermined confidence. In this engagement, the rapid succession of damaged or destroyed aircraft, whether confirmed kills or forced withdrawals, created the impression of disaster. Pilots breaking off attacks saw smoke trails and burning wreckage below. They could not always tell whether comrades had been shot down or merely disengaged. This uncertainty mattered. Air combat relied heavily on perception. A pilot who believed the sky was suddenly more dangerous adjusted behavior accordingly. The gunner's tactic did not just inflict damage, it altered the mental landscape of the fight. What made the tactic suicidal in later descriptions was not recklessness, but exposure. By firing early and often, the gunner made himself a priority target. Tracers led the eyes straight back to his position. Enemy pilots could and sometimes did return fire from longer range. This was why doctrine discouraged such behavior. It increased the likelihood of the gunner being hit. It placed personal survival secondary to collective defense. But war compresses morality into seconds. The choice was not between safety and danger. It was between different kinds of danger. Between waiting for a lethal pass or inviting fire on one's own terms. After the mission, such actions were rarely formalized immediately. Commanders were cautious. Ammunition expenditure, weapon overheating, and the risk of encouraging untrained crews to imitate the tactic without understanding its limits all weighed heavily. Yet the idea could not be unlearned. Reports circulated. Informal conversations spread the story. In mess halls and briefing rooms, gunners talked about firing earlier, about making fighters uncomfortable, about refusing to be predictable. No single directive marked the change. No official document declared a revolution in defensive gunnery. But doctrine is shaped as much by example as by orders. The engagement, as true significance, lay not in the exact number of enemy aircraft destroyed, a figure that would later be debated and sometimes exaggerated, but in the realization that defensive fire could be proactive. This understanding set the stage for the moment when everything converged. The height of the engagement, the minutes when attack after attack collapsed under sustained fire, and the sky itself seemed to recoil. That decisive stretch of time, the point at which theory gave way to consequences, where this story now turns. The first attack comes fast. Bf-19s drop out of the sun in a shallow dive. Engines screaming as they accelerate past 400 km per hour. The gunner sees them as dark crosses growing rapidly larger, their wings flashing as they adjust alignment. There is no hesitation now. The trigger is already depressed. Tracer fire arcs upward immediately. Not a short burst, not a warning, a sustained stream. The fighters were expecting silence until the final seconds. Instead, they fly into fire. The lead aircraft adjusts instinctively, rolling slightly to throw off aim. That fraction of a second is enough. The second aircraft closes behind him, compressing spacing. The third hesitates, momentarily uncertain whether to continue the dive or break away. The gunner tracks the formation as a whole, not individual targets. His fire walks through the attack path, forcing each pilot to make a decision under pressure. One aircraft passes through the cone and emerges trailing white coolant. Another jerks upward abruptly, abandoning the run. A third flashes past, close enough for the gunner to see the cockpit canopy, then disappears below, leaving a thin black trail that widens as it falls. There is no time to count, no time to celebrate. The second wave is already coming, from a different angle, higher and steeper. A textbook adaptation. German pilots are trying to restore control of the engagement by varying approach vectors. The gunner swings the weapon hard, fighting inertia and recoil, leading the dive before the aircraft is fully aligned. Again, fire erupts early. At these speeds, even a half-second longer under fire matters. One fighter takes hits along the wing route. The aircraft wobbles, then steadies, but its climb-out is sluggish. Another presses through, firing briefly, rounds striking armor but failing to penetrate. The exchange is brutal and close. Inside the aircraft, fragments hammer the fuselage. The pilot holds course, trusting the gunner to do his work. Coordination is silent but absolute. The third wave arrives almost immediately, compressed into a narrow window of time. The sky feels crowded now. Smoke trails mark damaged aircraft descending away. The gunner's arms ache. Ammunition belts rattle through the feed. The barrel glows faintly despite the cold. This is the moment later accounts will compress into a single phrase for minutes. In reality, it is a blur of overlapping attack runs, each lasting seconds, each forcing split-second decisions. One Bf-109 explodes abruptly, struck in a vulnerable point. Another rolls inverted, pieces separating as it falls. Others break off, damaged but flying, disappearing toward friendly lines. The gunner continues firing until the last attacker withdraws. Then, suddenly, the sky is empty. Silence replaces engine screams and gunfire. Only the steady vibration of the aircraft remains. Smoke drifts past the gun position, stinging the eyes. The gunner releases the trigger, hands shaking from fatigue and adrenaline. Below, wreckage burns on the snow-covered ground. How many aircraft have been destroyed is impossible to say at the moment. Some will crash, some will limp home, some will be claimed by multiple crews, their fates debated long after the war ends. What matters is not the precise tally, but the undeniable shift. An attack that should have been decisive has collapsed. A formation that was expected to dominate has been forced to disengage. And in the stunned quiet that follows, the implications begin to settle not just for the men aboard this aircraft, but for every crew that will fly into contested skies from this point forward. The second half of this turning point lies not only in the immediate outcome, but in how the moment is recorded, interpreted, and absorbed by both sides of the conflict. When the aircraft lands, there is no ceremony. There rarely is. Ground crews rush in, counting holes, tracing impact marks with gloved fingers. Mechanics peer into damaged panels. Someone points toward the gun mount, its barrel scorched, its feed nearly empty. The gunner climbs out slowly. His legs tremble. Only now does the weight of what just happened begin to register. Debriefings are clinical. Times are recorded. Directions noted. Claims are made cautiously. In wartime, aerial victory credits are notoriously complex. A pilot may claim a destroyed aircraft that later limps home. A gunner may fire at a fighter already fatally damaged by someone else. Confirmation requires wreckage, witnesses, or enemy records that may never be recovered. Later retellings will inflate numbers. 12 destroyed in 4 minutes becomes a headline, a symbol, a simplification. The truth is more nuanced. Some aircraft were certainly destroyed. Others were damaged badly enough to be written off. Some escaped, but even conservative assessments agree on one point. The engagement was unusually costly for the attackers and unusually survivable for the defenders. Enemy radio intercepts and unit diaries reveal confusion. Pilots reported unexpectedly heavy defensive fire. Commanders questioned whether formations had become predictable. Tactical notes began to emphasize variation, caution, and standoff attacks. On the defending side, the reaction was quieter but deeper. Crews talked. Gunners compared experiences. The idea that defensive fire could shape the engagement rather than merely respond to it began to circulate. Training officers listened carefully, even if official manuals lagged behind. The immediate tactical lesson was simple. Fighters could be forced to abandon clean approaches. The broader implication was more profound. Air combat was not solely dictated by speed and initiative on the attacker's side. Even vulnerable crews could influence the flow of battle through aggression and timing. This did not make gunners safer overnight. Casualty rates remained high. Many who tried similar tactics were killed attempting them. The method required judgment, knowing when early fire would disrupt an attack and when it would simply invite destruction. Doctrine, slowly and unevenly, adapted. By late 1943 and into 1944, Allied bomber formations increasingly emphasized continuous, overlapping defensive fire. Soviet units refined gunner training, focusing on sector denial rather than individual kills. Tracers were used deliberately to shape enemy behavior. Fighter pilots noticed. Luftwaffe. Reports from this period describe bomber formations that were difficult to penetrate and dangerous to approach directly. Attacks shifted toward head-on passes or coordinated mass assaults, tactics that carried their own risks. The engagement's turning point was not the destruction of a specific number of aircraft. It was the moment when an assumption broke that defensive crews would always wait, always react, always accept the terms imposed on them. Once that assumption failed, air combat became more costly for everyone. The gunner's action did not end the dominance of fighters. It did not reverse the course of the air war by itself. But it introduced a new variable into a system that had grown dangerously efficient. And as news of the encounter spread through reports, rumors, and post-war memory, it set the stage for the consequences that followed: changes in training, shifts in morale, and a re-evaluation of what survival meant in the air. Those consequences form the aftermath of this moment, where immediate survival gives way to lasting impact. In the days following the engagement, paperwork moved more slowly than rumor. Claims were logged, cross-checked, and often reduced. Commanders were cautious. Inflated numbers helped no one at headquarters, where strategic decisions depended on patterns, not legends. Aircraft loss, reports from German units in the sector showed an abnormal spike. Some fighters failed to return. Others came back damaged beyond repair. Maintenance logs recorded punctured radiators, shredded control surfaces, and unexplained failures following what should have been routine attack runs. No single report explained everything. Together, they told a story of an engagement that had gone wrong. On the defending side, the aircraft was examined repeatedly. Armor plates showed fresh scoring. Control cables bore new scars. The gun mount required replacement. The gunner's ammunition expenditure was noted high, even by desperate standards. There was no reprimand. That absence mattered. In an environment where deviation from doctrine could easily be punished, silence was a form of approval. The crew had survived. The mission had been completed. Enemy losses, whatever their exact number, were undeniable. Word spread informally, not through official communiques, but through conversations between crews. Gunners asked questions. Pilots listened. The idea that early, aggressive fire could disrupt fighter attacks became part of a growing body of unofficial knowledge. Commanders faced a dilemma. Encouraging such behavior openly risked chaos. Not every gunner had the discipline, endurance, or situational awareness to sustain fire without losing control. Ammunition shortages were real. Overheated weapons jammed at the worst moments. But ignoring the lesson was equally dangerous. Gradually, the language training shifted. Manuals did not yet endorse constant early fire, but they emphasized flexibility, judgment, sector denial rather than target fixation. Tracers were discussed not only as aiming aids, but as tools to influence enemy movement. This evolution mirrored similar changes elsewhere in the war. In the West, Allied bomber formations refined their defensive tactics, creating dense fields of interlocking fire that punished predictable approaches. On the Eastern Front, where formations were looser and engagements more chaotic, individual initiative mattered even more. The gunner's action became a reference point, not always named, often anonymized, but present in the collective memory of aircrews. It illustrated a truth many had sensed, but few had proven so starkly, that passivity invited precision, and precision killed. For German pilots, the aftermath was sobering. Encounters with unexpectedly aggressive defensive fire became more common. Losses mounted. Survivors adapted, favoring head-on attacks or coordinated strikes designed to overwhelm defenses quickly. These adaptations restored some balance, but at increased cost. Head-on attacks were dangerous. Mass assaults required coordination and exposed more aircraft to return fire. The sky grew more lethal for everyone. The engagement's immediate aftermath did not rewrite air combat overnight, but it accelerated trends already underway. It validated instincts born of fear and experience, and it reminded both sides that doctrine was not immutable. As months passed, the incident faded from official reports, replaced by larger battles and broader campaigns, but its influence lingered in the behavior of crews who flew knowing that survival sometimes depended on doing the unexpected. The second half of the aftermath lies not in reports or training changes alone, but in how this moment reshaped morale, memory, and the human understanding of risk in the air. For the men who flew after that day, the sky felt different, not safer, never safe, but less predetermined. Gunners spoke of engagement windows, not as moments to endure, but as spaces they could shape. Pilots began to trust their defensive crews more deeply, holding formation longer, resisting the instinct to jink or break at the first sign of attack. That trust mattered. In air combat, cohesion was survival. Psychologically, the shift was subtle but profound. Fear did not vanish, but it changed form. Instead of waiting helplessly for the impact of cannon fire, crews felt they had an option, however dangerous, to fight back on their own terms. This had consequences. Some crews pushed the tactic too far. Early firing without discipline led to empty belts at critical moments. Overheated guns jammed. Tracers drew return fire that found its mark. Losses followed. Commanders reinforced the idea that initiative required judgment, not recklessness. But even these failures reinforced the central lesson. Air combat was not a fixed script. For the Luftwaffe, the psychological effect was equally real. Pilots accustomed to dictating engagements now faced uncertainty. The predictable rhythm of attack and withdrawal was disrupted. Defensive fire could no longer be assumed to begin only at close range. This uncertainty accumulated. It increased stress. It shortened decision times. It eroded the margin for error in a war already pushing men and machines to their limits. By 1944, as Allied numerical superiority grew and fuel shortages constrained German training, these psychological pressures compounded material ones. Experienced pilots were lost faster than they could be replaced. New pilots faced skies that punished hesitation mercilessly. The incident also influenced how post-war historians and veterans remembered the air war. Stories of individual gunners standing their ground became symbols not of invincibility, but of adaptation under extreme pressure. Numbers were often rounded upward, timelines compressed, legends formed. Separating myth from reality remains essential. The claim of 12 destroyed in 4 minutes captures attention, but it is the behavior behind the claim that endures. Confirmed kills mattered less than the demonstrated effect on enemy behavior. Technology eventually absorbed the lesson. Later, aircraft incorporated more comprehensive defensive coverage. Formation tactics evolved. Escort fighters took on greater responsibility for protecting bombers, reducing reliance on defensive fire alone. Yet even as technology advanced, the core truth remained human. A single gunner, confronted with an impossible situation, chose to act differently, not recklessly, but deliberately. He exploited what he had: timing, volume of fire, and the psychology of the attacker to survive. This was not a turning point in the war's grand narrative. It did not decide campaigns or alter borders, but it revealed something enduring about warfare, that innovation often emerges not from planning rooms, but from moments of necessity, when survival demands imagination. As the war moved on, this moment receded into the vast archive of combat experiences, but its quiet influence persisted, shaping how crews thought about defense, initiative, and the thin line between caution and courage. And in reflecting on that influence, we arrive at the final consideration not of tactics or outcomes, but of meaning. War is often remembered through numbers. Aircraft destroyed, missions flown, miles advanced or lost. But numbers alone cannot explain why certain moments endure while others fade into statistics. This engagement endures because it exposes the fragile balance at the heart of air combat. The gunner did not change the laws of physics. He did not invent a new weapon or unlock a hidden advantage. He recognized a pattern and chose to break it. In doing so, he revealed how much modern warfare depends on expectation. When those expectations fail, even superior machines hesitate. The label suicidal is misleading. What he did was not a rejection of survival, but a redefinition of it. Waiting, in that sky, had become the more dangerous choice. Initiative, however risky, offered a chance, small, imperfect, but real. History often credits generals, engineers, and aces, yet wars are also shaped by anonymous decisions, made far from command tables. Decisions measured not in strategy, but in seconds, in breath, in whether a hand tightens on a trigger sooner than doctrine allows. The legacy of this moment is not a tally of downed fighters. It is the recognition that defense does not have to be passive, that even in the most asymmetric encounters, behavior matters, psychology matters. The willingness to act can reshape outcomes, even if only briefly. Air combat continued to evolve. Technology raced ahead. Missiles replaced guns. Distances increased. But the core lesson remained embedded in military thinking. Unpredictability is a weapon, and initiative can survive even under overwhelming pressure. Somewhere in the vast record of the Second World War, this engagement is just one entry among thousands. But for the crews who flew afterward, and for those who study the war today, it stands as a reminder, not of heroism alone, but of adaptation, and of the thin human margin on which history so often turns.